rioting, we should not be looting, we should not be tearing up our own communities. And then there's been an argument of the other side of we should be hitting them in the pocket. We should be focusing on the blackout days where we don't spend money. But, you know, I feel like we should do both. And I feel like I support both. And I'll tell you why I support both. I support both because when you have a civil unrest like this, there are three types of people in the streets. There are the protesters, there are the rioters, and there are the looters. The protesters are there because they actually care about what is happening in the community. They want to raise their voices, and they are there strictly to protest. You have the rioters who are angry, who are anarchists, who really just want to fuck shit up, and that's what they're going to do regardless. And then you have the looters. And the looters almost exclusively are just there to do that, to loot. Now, people are like, well, what did you gain? Well, what did you get from looting? I think that as long as we're focusing on the what, we're not focusing on the why, and that's my issue with that. As long as we're focusing on what they're doing, we're not focusing on why they're doing. And some people are like, well, those aren't people who are legitimately angry about what's happening. Those are people who just want to get stuff. Okay, well then, let's go with that. Let's say that's what it is. Let's ask ourselves why in this country in 2020, the financial gap between poor blacks and the rest of the world is at such a distance that people feel like their only hope and only opportunity to get some of the things that we flaunt and flash in front of them all the time is to walk through a broken glass window and get it. That they are so hopeless that getting that necklace, getting that TV, getting that change, getting that bed, getting that phone, whatever it is that they're going to get, is that in that moment when the riots happen and if they present an opportunity of looting, that's their only opportunity to get it. We need to be questioning that why. Why are people that poor? Why are people that broke? Why are people that food insecure, that clothing insecure, that they feel like their only shot, that they are shooting their shot by walking through a broken glass window to get what they need? And then people want to talk about, well, there's plenty of people who pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and got it on their own. Why can't they do that? Let me explain to you something about economics in America. And I'm so glad that as a child, I got an opportunity to spend time at Push where they taught me this, is that we must never forget that economics was the reason that black people were brought to this country. We came to do the agricultural work in the South and the textile work in the North. Do you understand that? That's what we came to do. We came to do the agricultural work in the South and the textile work in the North. Now, if I right now decided that I wanted to play Monopoly with you, and for 400 rounds of playing Monopoly, I didn't allow you to have any money, I didn't allow you to have anything on the board, I didn't allow you to have anything. And then we played another 50 rounds of Monopoly, and everything that you gained and you earned while you were playing that round of Monopoly was taken from you. That was Tulsa, that was Rosewood. Those are places where we built black economic wealth, where we were self-sufficient, where we owned our stores, where we owned our property, and they burned them to the ground. So that's 450 years. So for 400 rounds of Monopoly, you don't get to play at all. Not only do you not get to play, you have to play on the behalf of the person that you're playing against. You have to play and make money and earn wealth for them, and then you have to turn it over to them. So then for 50 years, you finally get a little bit and you're allowed to play. And every time that they don't like the way that you're playing, or that you're catching up, or that you're doing something to be self-sufficient, they burn your game. They burn your cards. They burn your Monopoly money. And then finally at the release and the onset of that, they allow you to play and they say, okay, now you catch up. Now at this point, the only way you're going to catch up in the game is if the person shares the wealth, correct? But what if every time you share the wealth, then there's psychological warfare against you to say, oh, you're an equal opportunity hire. So if I played 400 rounds of Monopoly with you and I had to play and give you every dime that I made, and then for 50 years, every time that I played, if you didn't like what I did, you got to burn it like they did in Tulsa and like they did in Rosewood, how can you win? How can you win? You can't win. The game is fixed. So when they say, why do you burn down the community? Why do you burn down your own neighborhood? It's not ours. We don't own anything. We don't own anything. There Trevor Noah said it so beautifully last night. There's a social contract that we all have, that if you steal or I steal, then the person who is the authority comes in and they fix the situation. But the person who fixes the situation is killing us. The social contract is broken. And if the social contract is broken, why the fuck do I give a shit about burning the fucking Football Hall of Fame, about burning a fucking Target? You broke the contract when you killed us in the streets and didn't give a fuck. You broke the contract when for 400 years we played your game and built your wealth. You broke the contract when we built our wealth again on our own, by our bootstraps in Tulsa, and you dropped bombs on us. When we built it in Rosewood and you came in and you slaughtered us. You broke the contract, so fuck your Target. Fuck your Hall of Fame. As far as I'm concerned, it can burn this bitch to the ground. And it still wouldn't be enough. And they are lucky that what Black people are looking for is equality and not revenge.
Okay.
That last line says a lot.
So what I would like for us to do, we want to try to self-manage. I want the conversation to be rich. If we find that we are talking over each other, I will mute everyone and then just drop a question mark in the comments, and then we'll follow that order to chime in, to speak, to participate. But let's just see if we can just do it on our own without that initially. What are your thoughts?
Well, that's not the first time I've seen that video, but it always breaks my because she really puts it very starkly for people to understand, and I think that I think as a white person, I think it would be really easy to get defensive when you see that. I don't get defensive. I just feel very, very sad that that's the foundation that we're working on today.
Thank you, Karen. Other comments?
Amy,
Yes.
could you explain what happened in Tulsa and Rosewood
Briefly, sure.
briefly?
So Tulsa is commonly referred to as Black Wall Street. It is an area where Black people built Black wealth. We owned our own homes, businesses, etc. And there was the Tulsa Massacre. Actually, next year will represent the 100th anniversary. And people were slaughtered, businesses and homes were destroyed. So quite like what she explained in the clip, is that when we are told sometimes to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, or get out here and make it, that's the American dream. In instances where we have done that, we meaning Black people, our communities have been destroyed, our people have been slaughtered.
I will chime in that.
Go ahead.
Yes, if I may, I'm looking right now. This is Yuri Rashkin, and for my own purposes, so to say, I'm going through how many people are voting in primaries and those kinds of numbers. And what I see is that there's one ward in Beloit that has 60 people that are registered to vote. And out of them, in August of 2016, one person voted. And then this spring election, when we had voting by mail for a lot of people, 10 people voted. And I believe it's one of the wards in the Merrill neighborhood. And it concerns me because I think that this is part of that ownership concept that was talked about in the video, that was talked about in terms of owning property or owning social contract. but owning the vote is an important part of that ownership process. So that's kind of an observation from my end. Thank you.
So
Just a side note for Tulsa's history lesson. It's the only place where bombs were dropped from airplanes on U.S. citizens too, because had incendiary devices on them. So that is when they say that when the federal building was blown up in Oklahoma City. And there's a lot of people that argue that that was not the first major, attack on people, U.S. citizens.
And thank you, Ms. Sloan. I'm seeing in the comments that Black Wall Street was burned 3 times, not just once. An important point.
it's also not the only example of destruction and dispossession. There are, it's a big one that affected multiple people, but individuals lost their homes through fraud and pressure and terror. And with the people not voting, the fear that I have is people have been pushed down so far that they feel they have nothing to live for. They have no future. And at that point, everything becomes immediate gratification, what's in the now. And just telling people some kind of future reward for a behavior is not going to change that mindset. And I don't know.
Absolutely.
Unmute. I think it's so important, this feeling that she's representing in the video of anger, and it's so important for us to allow that that rage, because there's so much bottled up. If you think of hundreds of years of this emotion that has had to be, capped if you want to be accepted. But I also want to incorporate something that's really, I think, missing from the media a lot of times, is that much of the looting was actually done by, not by people from the community, but by white vigilantes coming in, just like in so many of the cases in civil rights movement and the Black Panthers, even worse, to the point of assassinations, is that the violence is very often perpetrated by people outside the community, by white people trying to blame, kind of put the blame on these Black people in the community. And I think that's missing from her conversation, but also from the media in general. So I think that's something we need to incorporate. Thank you.
And 2 important points that I would like to highlight. Mary, I believe it was you who brought up the ideas of displacement and dispossession. Our country was built on displacement and dispossession. I would encourage all of you in your spare moments to look up the 1619 Project, which talks about the history of slavery in the United States. And we've had 401 years of displacement and dispossession.
Oh, Diane. Oh,
Yeah, if you have a comment, feel free to jump in.
Diane.
You have to unmute yourself, Diane.
Okay, is that better?
Yes.
I just feel that a lot of the looting went on by people who were just opportunistic as well, and figured, well, there are people down here rioting, I think I can in and break buildings and take what I want, and they will just blame the riot people or the people who are protesting, and I can get away with this at this time. So I think there were different motives for some of that looting.
I know we have several police officers with us. Is there any data? Is there any way that you can help us know who's responsible for this behavior?
So before we hear from the police officers, may I say something, please?
Absolutely.
So I think it's important for us to be really careful about the language that we use. Now, we have just heard about, someone mentioned, both in the video and someone here, about Tulsa, about Rosewood. I mentioned that there have been massacres of Black people in almost every major city that Black people moved to after or during the Great Migration. And so I want us to be careful about how we characterize rioting, because very often people refer to those historical, what I think of as massacres, as incidents, even though tens and hundreds of Black people were murdered. So I want us, when we refer to what I think of as a rebellion or as a protest, rioting is a different sort of thing, and I want us to be clear about our language. Now, if you mean to say riot, that's great, and you may have good reasons for doing that. But I want us to not conflate protests with rebellion, with riots. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that point. And I would just remind everyone that our topic is protesting, rioting, and looting, and the difference between those three things. Thank you so much.
I was just going to say something about it struck me when she said the why, not the what. Why are they doing it? Not the what that it's happening. It's like, oh, let's talk about this instead of the more important of why.
I think too, when we discount the looting by saying, oh, it really wasn't them, it was other people who came in and did it, we're also discounting the anger that she was telling us about, and the reasons why some people believe that looting was just one tiny way to get back what they have lost. So then this is like reasoned people doing these other things, but looters are angry people, and she tells us why they're angry. And so let's not discount that justified anger that she's talking about.
Amy, if I can, this is Kevin. I heard that, and I don't know if I totally understand the protesting. I get that piece. The part that I struggle with is the looting. I don't understand how that helps us or help anyone to get their cause across. I mean, the protesting are sending a message. We are standing for this. We're standing for the wrong. We want betterment we want equality for all. Looters and, to me, rioters are taking it to a different level. We're talking about the three topics. Protesting is sending a message. I fail to see, and it could just be me, and if someone can enlighten me, how the rioting and the looting, how that plays into the message that we're trying to, deliver.
My response, and I would love to hear from other people, is she pretty clearly laid that out, and that categorizing the three different groups. So rioting and looting may not have anything to do with the protesting, but outlining the differences.
So I would like to address what the question Kevin put on the table. So I think maybe in a perfect world, it would be that everybody would just kind of stay in their lane and do what they need to do. I think we need to remember where we live. So we live in a capitalist state. And in this moment, things are more valuable than many people. We understand property as more valuable than people. And so when people are protesting and there's no sort of action on their demands, of course they're gonna burn stuff down, because then people pay attention when property is being burned. And I think that I think it's important to pay attention to the context. You know, when people say things like, well, but you're destroying your neighborhood, or well, you should just be orderly. Whose frame is that? Whose context is that? You know, like the young woman in the video said, you know, many people in her community don't own property. So whose context is it that says we must be orderly? In whose perspective is that the way to be? I just offer that as something to think about. Thank you.
If I may just kind of pose a question back to Lisa, and I hear what you're saying, but I guess I'm still confused. I get the protesting, I think the video did great in explaining it, and I get the protesting, but I just have a problem. I'm trying to understand or wrap my arms around going into an establishment, and I don't care whose establishment it is, and cleaning out an establishment, and I'm still trying to connect how that relates to the message that we're trying to send. And I get what people are always saying, we're destroying our own neighborhood as well. I just remember years ago in Beloit when they had turmoil here, well, it was the Merrill neighborhood, the places that a lot of African Americans visited or patronized that we attacked. So that's where my struggle comes in. It seems as though we're attacking or going after the places that we patronize. And that's when I say, well, are we just destroying something that we patronize or go to? Because when it's all said and done, then what do we have left in our neighborhoods? We don't have anything. Then we're stuck going to other neighborhoods to get what we want.
I have something to say, and I think the bottom line is respect. If the protesters have something they need to say and they're going to be peaceful, and the police respect them, and they respect the police and the job that they have to do to keep order, and then the protesters respect the store owners, you know, and the store owners have nothing to do with the protest. Do you understand what I'm saying? So everybody, if they all have respect for the other person, that would help. So we can sit on at the same table and have a discussion about what we need to do.
I think that's all well and good if everyone starts at the same playing field, but this is not an even playing field.
Yeah.
The protesters aren't necessarily the rioters. So the rioters are different than the protesters, and the looters are different. And I think she explained that in the video. And I think what is hard for probably some of us to grasp, because we've not lived the life that the rioters and the looters are living, but I think she addressed that in her video too. They are just so, they don't know what else to do at this point. They are so oppressed and so fed up that they don't, the things that they're taking are things that are waved in front of their face, that they, no matter what they do, they'll never be able to have that. And it's not just for that reason only, but it's that oppression that Have you ever been in a situation where you just think, I don't think I can take much more? And maybe you say something or you do something that you wished you hadn't. I think they're pushed to such, I mean, we talk about 450 years this has been going on. And when she stated in her video that they came to work the fields in the South and they came to do the work in the mills in the North, when she said that, I thought, oh, I know she's in the moment, but I was like, you didn't come here. You were forced here. You were kidnapped basically from your country and brought here against your will in unbearable conditions. So it's been happening to them since the beginning of them coming here. And I hate to say them. I don't know a better way to say it at this point. If I say our Black brothers and sisters, if I say, I'm not sure how to say it. I hate referring to people as them, as if they're different than us. Sorry.
I think that's a good point, and I would just like to say that, you know, we're all talking about this as rational people, but if you think about how trauma can create anger in a person, a child or an adult, where they do behavior that hurts themselves, they harm themselves because they're so angry. And I think maybe that is, she says that, she talks about the anger. And I think it's really hard for us, as you know, sitting here rationally in our home, to really comprehend what that anger must feel like in the gut. Who of us would not maybe do something that we know is harmful and even damages our cause because we are so angry, we just have to do something awful to get what we don't even know. And I think that's part of it. They don't even know sometimes when they're angry and lashing out. And adults do it and children do it all the time. And this time it's in the streets. and that's on television. And that's what makes it seem so different. But I really don't think their behavior is that unusual.
I think it's unrealistic to expect people to behave rationally. Let's just talk this over. Let's talk it out. When you have had generations, hundreds of years of oppression and abuse in your family history, I don't see how people can, I think it's wonderful if they can maintain their self-control. But I think when people just are docile about their protesting, if you remember 2011, what good did that docile protesting we did at the Capitol do? Then nothing happens because you know it'll go away, it'll stop. So I think that it's important, whether we like the idea or not, for people to make a point that you can't just forget, that you can't just give up, that you have to react to in maybe a visceral way, just as they are. I'm not against them, but I don't think, I think it's nice if we have orderly protests because we like it, it's sweet, and we go, oh, yay. But there has to be more if you really seriously want change, if you really seriously want people to pay attention to you.
This is Deb Colsty. Can I make a comment?
Absolutely.
So it's hard for us to internalize what it would be like to have been oppressed for the most of us, because we're not very many of us Black. My clock's going to start chiming here. But anyway, just at the start of all this protest, I lost my husband. And I can internalize that if I thought somebody was responsible for that death or harming my family, the pain would be unbearable. And I don't know how I'd react. So I can't pretend to know what it's like to be Black. But I do know what it's like to be hurt And I do know that that hurt. If I thought somebody was doing something malicious to myself or my family and caused death or injury, you know, I understand the anger. Thank you.
Deb, thank you so much. And definitely my condolences to you. I would like to loop back to Bridget. Thank you for being uncomfortable with calling other people them. And my Black brothers and sisters is wholly acceptable, if that is what you would choose to use. And the other thing that I would offer as a point of context, I know that many of us watched the murder of George Floyd. And I would just like you to think about, if that was someone, if you are not a member of the global majority, and if George Floyd looked like you, if George Floyd looked like your brother, your husband, your uncle, your father, how would you feel? And what might your reaction be? And would it be completely lucid or rational or decent or orderly? So I invite you to share your thoughts about our first video. We have a few more minutes and then we'll move on to our second.
This is Kevin again. Great question. I like that. So sitting here thinking about what you just asked, certainly I would be livid. Certainly I would be very upset. Certainly I would want action. And I would do what I can to make sure that action and justice is served. Having said that, I still don't believe that I would resort to the looting piece. I'm still, as you can see, I'm still struggling with pulling those two together. I would certainly be upset, and I would be, I would be protesting because I want justice to be done. But in the back of my mind, I would be saying, well, we go out and riot and loot. That's diluting our really message, because that's what everybody's going to focus on. Say, here's the bad part of what they're doing. They're not focusing so much on the protesting.
Isn't looting a form of protest though? And isn't there a way that we can stop thinking that today is today and it has nothing to do with the past? It has everything to do with the past. And it has to do with the past of our Black brothers and sisters in this country. There's got to come a moment of reckoning, and it's probably not going to come in one big swoop, but honestly, if we don't start acting like we understand what this is all about, I don't see how we can move forward as people of sympathy, and sympathy is shallow, of people of empathy and determination to make right the wrongs.
I don't want to take away from the context of Black Lives Matters, but I find it interesting as I'm thinking about rioting and protesting and looting, about the historical context of the Vietnam War, the Stonewall riots. I mean, was the conversation different then than it is now? But that protesting and rioting advanced the cause for peace and also for gay rights. I guess I'm likening the current protesting to the same change in the same shift in cultural thinking. Does it rise to the same level? I guess I'm just more thinking out loud than making a comment.
I think there's a point there, but I'm not sure it's the direction you were going in. The Vietnam riots and the anti-Vietnam riots and the Stonewall riots, there was progress that went forward in the 1960s. Also in the 1960s, there were a lot of riots in Black inner city neighborhoods. And I grew up in Madison. When the riots were over in Madison, they took the plywood off the windows, they fixed up the stores, and everything was fine again. H Street in Washington, D.C., Watts, a lot of these other neighborhoods, nothing happened. H Street in Washington, D.C. was just starting to come back in 2008, 40 years later. So why is it that white people get to riot and move their cause forward and Black people can't?
Mary, thank you for that. So a couple things. One, I would like for us to think about who is doing the protesting and how is the protesting viewed. And even when we get to additional labels of rioting and looting, and the first thing that jumps into my mind is the Boston Tea Party and how for the most part that is celebrated. Who was providing the pushback and how is it framed? What community is it happening in and how is it framed? So just some things to think about. As with any rich dialogue on a deep topic, we're not always going to have resolution. So we're going to leave this here. We are going to head into our next video clip that gives an overview of the militarization of the police. And after the clip, we'll pick up discussion from there.
This was a protest near the White House on June 1st.
We've given you a 40-cent raise, Peyton. Congratulations. I can still picture that exact moment when
it has been an entirely peaceful protest.
It was met by forces with helmets, riot shields, rifles, and tear gas. The authorities here were a mix of police and military. There were Secret Service, Park Police, the National Guard, prison special operations, and local police from a nearby county. But can you tell which ones are the police? If it's hard to tell, it's these guys, by the way. It's because America's police have been looking more and more like troops. So why do American police officers look like soldiers? And where did they get all these weapons?
Don't shoot! This was a peaceful protest!
In the 1980s, police in America looked more like this. The US's crime rate had been doing this, and President Reagan called for the military to work more directly with the police for the war on drugs.
Drugs are menacing our society. We must move to strengthen law enforcement activities.
Congress agreed, and over the next few years passed a series of bills to give police access to military bases and equipment, for the National Guard to assist police with drug operations, for the military and police to train together, and eventually to have the military loan police departments their excess leftover equipment for free. This would become known as the 1033 program. Police departments got assault rifles like M16s, armored trucks, and even grenade launchers. And before long, it started to have an effect on how police police. We can see that in the number of times SWAT teams were used. Departments that had deployed them about once a month in the 80s were using them more than 80 times a year by 1995. Almost all of these deployments were for drug-related search warrants, usually forced entry searches called no-knock warrants. The police were becoming militarized, and people noticed. This 1997 article said it made police look like an occupying army. In February of 1997, two men robbed a bank in North Hollywood, Los Angeles. They had automatic rifles and body armor. The police didn't. By the time it ended, a dozen police officers were injured. In the aftermath of the shootout, California police demanded they be equipped with the like the AR-15. But so did police in places from Florida to Connecticut. And that same year, the 1033 program was expanded, dropping the requirement that police departments use the equipment for drug-related enforcement. Now, any law enforcement, even university police, could access leftover military weapons for any reason. A retired police chief in Connecticut told the New York Times, "I was offered tanks, bazookas, anything I wanted." Because complete records on these loans weren't kept until 2015, we don't know exactly how much equipment was given out in those early years. But we do have data on how much of it police departments still have from each year it was given out. And you can see a steady growth in the program for most of the 90s and 2000s. And then something happens around here.
The rest of our troops in Iraq will come home by the end of the year.
In 2011, the US military formally withdrew its troops from Iraq. That meant the military had a lot of equipment and one less war to use it on, so it became available to the police. This is a mine-resistant ambush protected vehicle, or MRAP. It's among the most controversial equipment given out under the 1033 program. And we know from the data that police departments still have several hundred of them that they got in 2013 and 2014, but none from 2015. That's because in August of 2014, the 1033 program became national news.
We just said hands up, don't shoot, and they just start shooting.
A police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, had shot and killed an unarmed black teenager, Michael Brown. Afterwards, the community's protests were met by heavily militarized police who pointed sniper rifles at them as they marched.
Tear gas and armored tanks became a familiar sight in Ferguson, Missouri.
The police departments around the country have been getting a lot of this type of equipment.
President Obama responded with an executive order curbing the 1033 program.
We've seen how militarized gear can sometimes give people a feeling like there's an occupying force as opposed to a force that's part of the community that's protecting them and serving them.
2 years later, President Trump's administration reversed it.
We will not put superficial concerns about public safety.
But by that point, the 1033 program had become a lot less important anyway. This chart shows that by 2016, most MRAPs loaned out by the military went to smaller police departments. That means when larger cities today have MRAPs and other military gear, it's often because they've bought it themselves. And that's because police having military gear and weapons no longer depends on any one government program. It's now a part of how police see themselves.
The thing that I think is really important is with that equipment comes a certain mentality.
This is Arthur Reiser. He's a former military police officer, former civilian police officer, and now studies police militarization. A big part of his research is about that mentality. And he shared a poll he did of police officers with us.
I ask officers, do you have any problem with police officers routinely on patrol carrying military grade equipment or dressing in military type of uniforms? And the vast majority of those officers told me, no, I have no problem with that. And then the second question I asked is, do you think it changes the way that officers feel about themselves and their role in policing? And the vast majority of officers again said, yes. And what they said was it makes them more aggressive, more assertive, and it can make them more violent. And then finally, I asked them, how do you think the public perceives you? And the vast majority said it scares them. They know that it scares the public. They know that it makes them more aggressive or more assertive, and that could be dangerous, but they don't seem to care.
There are definitely times when it's been more clearly beneficial for the police to have this equipment. For example, during the Pulse nightclub shooting in 2016, Orlando police used an armored military vehicle to stop the shooter. But those moments tend to be the exception. Today, this equipment is still mostly used by SWAT teams for executing drug-related search warrants. And more than half of those are still no-knock warrants, the kind that Louisville police were executing when they killed Breonna Taylor. And in the case of the Ferguson protests, the Department of Justice found that the heavily militarized presence served to escalate rather than de-escalate the overall situation. The military and the police are supposed to serve different purposes. A military protects an us from a them. A police officer is supposed to be a part of the us. But when police think of themselves as soldiers, that can change.
What is the police officer going to do with an assault rifle when he's facing a protest. Seriously, when you give someone a hammer, why are you surprised that everything looks like a nail to them?
What are our thoughts?
The Beloit and Janesville and the county, I believe, share a vehicle. What has the use of that been since it was incorporated into the policing? I'm going to say 6-7 years ago, something like that.
Chief Moore here. I can offer, first of all, with the military equipment, what I have here at the PD is 4, get my video back on here. What I have here are 4 ceremonial rifles. If you've ever seen our honor guard, that is military equipment. And I've got 1 outdated night vision binocular set that we don't use. So that's all the military equipment we have here. Yeah, as far as the armored vehicle, and I'll let the sheriff and Chief Zabalski weigh in, but largely if we have an armed suspect in a home, that's when we tend to use it in conjunction with our SWAT team, but it's all about keeping our officers safe. I don't see it used much just on drug search warrants. If it were to be, it'd be because we know there's an armed person in there. But it affords us the opportunity to get our officers close to a home where we know they could be harmed. The secondary use for that is probably parades and National Night Out, but I don't think you'll see us rolling it out in those types of circumstances very much anymore.
If
Mr. Knudsen, go ahead, and then Janelle will hear from you.
Went a little bit on that barricade. I think our stuff, like the chief said, is largely defensive type use of that equipment there. Bearcat allows our SWAT officers to be exposed to a very dangerous situation without putting themselves at risk. For us, particularly out in the county, people have a lot of...
Troy, you're all scratchy. We can't really hear you. Is there something with your mic?
Sit closer.
Can you hear me now? Maybe I'm way down in the sticks, and it may be that the internet is not the best out here. Is it coming across now?
Better.
All right. I guess just to speak from the county perspective, a lot of times the people we're dealing with as far as armed barricaded subjects in a residence, if they're in a farmhouse, if they have a deer rifle or something like that, they have scopes. Those are high-powered weapons. If we're trying to approach that out in an area that's wooded, it's one thing, but if it's an open field, you really are pretty susceptible on the way to that location just to even contain it. And that's a pretty scary thing if you are sending your people out to do that. If you were to think of, one of your kids becoming a police officer and taking on that job and being sent up to, deal with somebody at a house, and they have to cross 100 yards of open field with a guy who's in the dark in his house with a scoped rifle, it's a scary thing. If we can provide them a level of protection on their way to get close there, that's, I think, been the real value of that Bearcat. And that's how we've used it in dangerous situations, just to protect our people moving in there. So I see it much more as a defensive thing. And in my position, not so much being the one going to the front door anymore, but being the one who has to send them, it does give me a certain sense of comfort knowing at least we've provided them the protection that we can. If we had access to that sort of stuff and we didn't use it, and then something bad happened, it would be a difficult thing to live with. And I know people sometimes think, well, you've got body armor on, but that only covers a small part of your body. And with some of the rifles and things that people have out in the community, it doesn't provide near the protection that we need. I did appreciate in the video that they mentioned that Hollywood shootout situation, the Hollywood bank robbery. I do think that that was a pretty important moment in American policing here, where police did find themselves seriously outgunned by some people who had access to what people in our community had access to. And they took advantage of it and used it for bad purposes. And I think it really put law enforcement in a difficult situation. I think they did the best they could with what they had, but I think some of what you see now certainly is a response to that very dangerous situation. And I certainly would worry about finding one of my people, having to deal with an adversary quite like that. Well, I do see the concerns. I think the video kind of does show both sides pretty well there, and I think there's important points going both ways. Myself, just being able to sleep at night when you're sending out your SWAT team to deal with something very serious, it's nice to know that they've got protective equipment to keep them as safe as you can.
Thank you. Now.
I think I just wanted to add, I appreciate hearing from the sheriff's department, the police chiefs. It does definitely bring perspective. I have family in law enforcement, and that has been something that has been very, it's been a very, both sides of the coin, I think, for me for the last few months. But I think what I see a lot and what I hear a lot is that there is an intimidation level when there is no trust, between communities of color in particular, and policing and the over policing, perceived or justified. I'm not weighing in on that. I'm just saying, and you have that breakdown in trust, and then they're seeing all of these, weapons constantly. That's what they see, or what we see too. When you're looking at all sides, it does make you feel very much like there is an intimidation factor. There is an over policing and a control that feels very much like just more oppression on the already oppressed. And I think that that's where a lot of the anger comes from. That's where I don't know where those conversations begin. And yeah, if all of that made sense, I hope it did, but that's kind of what I have to say.
Thank you, Janelle. Lisa, you had something you wanted to share?
Were you maybe referring, I had posted something in the chat.
Somebody else wanted to say something first. That's okay.
Oh.
Okay. If we could hear from Michelle and then Lisa, that'd be great.
Okay. Yeah, I think, the video brought up a lot for me. I had learned about that program in some of my law school courses, but before law school, I predominantly worked in Dane County and Milwaukee County, and I did case management for kids who had very severe and persisting mental health issues, and we did a lot of crisis planning. So I was in charge of making the crisis plans, and for every single one of those plans, calling the police was the last thing on the plan. And we have just really had to look at what are all the other things, what are all the other tools that we can use to address the crisis first. And so I just think about that, like, what he talked about, the hammer, you give someone a hammer and everything is a nail. I think about, what are the tools that we're giving police, that then it's like, these are the tools they turn to. My brother's been a police officer for quite a while, and I know he talked about that in his training when he was first starting out, and how he was trained on all of the tools on in his belt. But so just this idea that I know we talk a lot about training on de-escalation and things like that, and I can't help that a lot of, I know it's the cases that I've seen, and it's not, I don't have data from it, but a lot of the body cam footage that I see so many opportunities that I personally feel like de-escalation could have been used, but they went to one of their other tools first. And so I do have worries about that. Plus you add implicit bias to the mix. And so I worry about how those things, I worry about all those things. Additionally, he talked about the us versus them, and that's come up recently because, my brother, again, he is on a SWAT team, and for these protests, he has had to be on the rooftop with a sniper. And then I've got my sister-in-law talking about, blaming the protesters and the anger that's towards the protesters. And I could be one of those people in that crowd. And then it becomes, he's missing time with his family because of these protesters, where my perspective is, and I haven't voiced this yet, I plan to, but I get a little nervous about these conversations, is I'm sorry that your agency feels the need for there to be a sniper on the roof for a protest. But it's hard because I get this, if I push back, then I'm not supporting, then I don't, then I'm against my brother. So I just related to those pieces. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Lisa?
Thank you for that, Michelle. That was really powerful. So I wonder if we could pull out a little bit and think about the history of policing in the US. Because way before police had military weapons, they had billy clubs, and they still beat people with them, right? So I want us to recognize why police forces were made, right? Police departments, what that history is, and who they were meant to serve. It's not the case that police departments were originally intended to serve Black people or communities of color. They were intended to serve white communities. And if you read, in the first half, we talked about massacres in various parts of the country. On the forefront of many of those were police officers. They weren't, random white vigilantes. So I want us to think about the role of policing in our culture. And I want us to think about the context of police in our culture. So it's not the case, and I disagree when people say that all police officers are bad. Police officers are doing what the dominant culture pays them to do. What we need to do is figure out how we want them to operate so that they serve everybody in the same way, so that some communities are not afraid of police officers, so that some communities don't hesitate to call because they're afraid that they're gonna get killed. You know what I mean? We need to think about what kind of policing is required so that lots of different communities can feel safe with police officers. It's not just the case that police are neutral parties. That's not true. And our histories tell us that that's not true. Thank you.
Lisa, I think you bring up a very important point, and I would encourage each of us that are interested to definitely research this. But policing began as slave patrols and the recapturing of enslaved people. And I think when the roots of the organization are as such, we really have to look at how this has evolved and what was the intended trajectory of policing. Okay. Greg, I believe, had a comment that he wanted to share. Greg, go ahead and jump in.
I guess there are a couple things that just throughout this whole discussion going on. One of them was a study when they started looking at police response in how much, the police officers are all members of the community. And so the level of racism within a community is reflected within many police departments. So it's not just the police department's fault, but you got to start looking at what is the entire community like. And that'll start to give you an idea. And the other comment was that when we look at where we're struggling enough right now looking at how police departments interact with the community. And I think we've been fairly lucky here. But then we start looking at the government using the military as police officers with the intent of aggravating the protesters to create a situation to justify the fact that they're there in the first place. So, we now have government using people in communities that does not meet their call or doesn't meet the Constitution. But it's all now policing is starting to turn into a political issue.
Thank you so much, Greg. And I think we can look at situations like what's going on in Portland and Seattle. I think Portland is on like day 60 of consistent protest and thinking about who is there to police the people. Are those people from their community? Are those people that are sent in? What are some of the reasons behind that? One thing that encourages me is if the intent is to create an other or a threatening scenario, because of the diversity of the protesters that are in the street, it's difficult to convince people that those people are causing a problem or they are other when it's your children who are out there. And so, like I said, the diversity of the protest, you see the mothers showing up, etc. When it's your kids in the streets, it's more difficult to convince you that these are the scary people that you should be afraid of. These are the other. We have a few more minutes before we go into our final clip, but other comments that you would like to add?
This is Karen, and I would like to say something. One of the things I think we need to ask ourselves is who gets attracted to becoming a police officer? And I think, it's not just one type of person. As a former social worker, I know that when I worked in child care institutions, the one thing we knew is that people who love working with children were attracted to it, but so were pedophiles. So you have to be aware that who is attracted to it. So I wonder who's attracted to policing. As a social worker, I found a lot of police officers become social workers. And I think those are the kind of police you really kind of want in a police force. They're people who really care about other people, who want to make a difference in other people's lives. But I also think that there are people who are attracted to the power and control. And I think as police forces, I wonder how much do they start to look for that kind of person and really closely monitor them, because I think that when you get people who are looking for power and control, they're more likely to be police officers who are going to act in a way that's going to cause problems down the road. So just a couple thoughts.
I can weigh in on that. I can tell you, when I hire police officers, I don't care how fast they can run. I don't care how fast they can drive a car. I don't care how well they can shoot a gun. What I look for are people of character, people of empathy, and that truly care about others, because my most successful police officers have those traits. And so when I'm vetting for my agency, that's what we're looking for. And I tell you what, if we've got somebody that's just in it for the power and control, they aren't going to last very long here.
I would say the same for Milton as well. That's one of the reasons why we do psychological screening even before we bring somebody on the department. And I have had my psychologist give me a report that showed concerns over that, someone who wanted to dominate or show power. Again, like Chief Moore said, that those aren't the kinds of people that we want not only to work in our communities, but to live amongst our neighbors. And we can't speak for every organization. I can only speak for my own. And that's something that I very closely monitor and hire the right people, number one, and have the high expectations once they're on board that that's not how we're going to treat one another.
Thank you so much for adding that. I think the culture of the department is so important, and whether it's a warrior mindset or it's a guardian mindset. So thank you so much, both of you, for adding those comments. Are there other questions, comments from the audience?
I thought maybe I was.
I'm wondering. Sorry.
Go ahead, Fran.
I'm wondering, Amy, as far as psychological tests, do they continue in the career of law enforcement, or is it just on the hiring and that's it?
Good question. Gentlemen, could you respond to that?
Well, I know at least in one case where I chose to pass on hiring an individual, he did end up working at another department. So whether or not that department does a robust background and psychological screening that I did, I can't answer that. But I know that he is currently working in law enforcement, even though I felt that he wasn't right for me.
And Fran, if I was hearing you correctly, the other portion of that question is it just the initial psychological testing, or does that something that reoccurs? I would imagine that police experience trauma on the job, in the line of duty and possibly otherwise. Do you check in periodically with those psychological evaluations?
Well, now this is something I'm going to try not to preach too long on, because this is one of the things I'm very passionate about. In fact, I'm going to school right now to become a counselor to treat trauma in public safety people. We do not do that back checking enough. We don't, much as the rest of society, we do not normalize mental health. We stigmatize mental health, and people who struggle with trauma, struggle with depression, anxiety. We are but a microcosm of the rest of society, and we are fighting those issues too. And one of the things that I would like to see at some point someday, that we do normalize the, hey, once a year, sit down with somebody, just check in, see how things are going before things go too far. And it's going to take a lot of work and a long time to get over these hurdles. But it's something that I would really love to see over the next years.
I'm so pleased to hear that you do that in Milton. I don't know if the other communities in the area do the psychological testing. And I'm wondering if it could be made a rule, a guideline for the whole state, that psychological testing is part of the guidelines for hiring somebody in police work. Is that a possibility?
Yeah, I can share with you. It is a state guideline that there needs to be a psychological evaluation of a police officer before hire. I was very fortunate. About probably 10 years ago, I had a deputy chief that went through a very tragic circumstance in his family. And he was concerned about dealing with it. But he was very open in the department. He said, you know what, I need some help on this. And he went in and got some help. And he shared with everybody how important seeking out that help was. And what it did for our organization, it made it very normal and routine. I shouldn't say routine, but people were then willing to go and get help and talk about it. So it really built a culture of it's okay to go get help. And it's okay to stay healthy, and that it's a very tragic situation, but an unintended outcome was very good for us. Fran, to your specific question, we don't mandate any ongoing psychological evaluations. Certainly fitness for duty if we see anything, but we're addressing those issues as we see them. These officers are watched pretty carefully. We've got field supervisors out there with them 24/7. We got a camera on their shoulder, and we have the ability to watch everything they're doing out in the field. So probably more than most industries, we've got an awful lot of oversight as to what's going on out there, and rightfully so. And we can get folks some help or have them leave the profession if need be.
I'll weigh in that a little bit too. And mental health checks, and there's some departments in the state that do annual mental health checks with their personnel. That's something that I think a lot of us, or at least speaking for myself, would advocate for very strongly. But we're in a position where we can't afford it. It's a budgeting issue. And so things of that nature, well, I think would be very good, because I don't think the level of reticence in today's law enforcement officers, we have a very young department, is like it was 20 years ago. I think most people would be very participative in a program like that. We talk about peer support programs as well to help deal with officer trauma. And I appreciate your comments, Amy, because there is a lot of trauma over the course of our careers, things that we see and are involved in. And I think that is an important component that I would love to see pushed further along, not only from make it part of the training or the organizations themselves, but something that is funded as well, so that organizations that don't have a lot of revenue also get that benefit. Because I think there is something to be said for the psychological ability to go out every day and treat everyone with dignity and respect, or stand in a protest line and get belittled and denigrated and maintain your composure. That does take its toll. So I think that's an important point.
Thank you so much. I'm just throwing this out there. Gentlemen in law enforcement, feel free to run with it. But what if we could, when I say we, I mean you all, could partner with programs that do counseling services to see if there could be in-kind donations or some type of reduced rate, or counselors in training that need their hours to partner with police departments to do these evaluations, or to provide support or help to make the peer training program more robust. Just throwing some things out there.
I can speak to that for just a second, if you can still hear me. This year for 2020 in our budget, we added $10,000 for a mental health counselor to do work with our people should they deal with some trauma. We have to do a serious situation, something of that nature. And then earlier this year, we got approached by Rock County Health and Human Services, and they had applied for a grant to provide additional funds that way to coordinate wellness resources throughout the county for law enforcement. And that is getting towards the final stages of contracting with a provider, and then reaching out and coordinating with the resources that exist throughout our county to provide that sort of thing for our law enforcement officers.
That's great.
One of the reasons, again, why I'm pursuing this field is there is also sometimes a reticence on the part of a public safety person to enter a counseling relationship with somebody who has no understanding of what the stressors of the job are. And so to have a 20-year vet, maybe with some PTSD, a career of cumulative stress, and then a critical incident, to have that person sit down with a counselor in training is a difficult ask. And there are possibilities there that if we can get people who understand and are willing to work with public safety and develop that trust, and we certainly have those providers already in this county, that helps get people in the door too.
Thank you. All right, so the time flew by. We are approaching our final clip, and I was just going to end on it and then we roll right into the parking lot. But I would like to leave a couple minutes after the clip just for final remarks. And then if there are any comments, the next clip is from Clint Smith, and it is a portion of his TED Talk. So we've talked about protesting, rioting, and looting, and the distinct difference between those three categories. And we've also talked about the militarization of the police. And our final clip is a Black man sharing his experience with policing and what that means when you are wrapped in Black flesh, and what the conversations that parents have to have with their children. And it really resonated with me. So I'm going to share my screen. We'll watch the final clip and we'll have just a couple minutes for discussion.
Growing up, I didn't always understand why my parents made me follow the rules that they did. Like, why did I really have to mow the lawn? Why was homework really that important? Why couldn't
If you manage a team, you have to try Monday.com. Monday.com is a platform to track everything.
Couldn't I put jelly beans in my oatmeal? My childhood was abound with questions like this. Normal things about being a kid, and realizing that sometimes it was best to listen to my parents even when I didn't exactly understand why. And it's not that they didn't want me to think critically. Their parenting always sought to reconcile the tension between having my siblings and I understand the realities of the world while ensuring that we never accepted the status quo as inevitable. I came to realize that this, in and of itself, was a very purposeful form of education. One of my favorite educators, Brazilian author and scholar Paulo Freire, speaks quite explicitly about the need for education to be used as a tool for critical awakening and shared humanity. In his most famous book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, he states, "No one can be authentically human while he prevents others from being so." I've been thinking a lot about this lately, this idea of humanity, and specifically who in this world is afforded the privilege of being perceived as fully human. Over the course of the past several months, the world has watched as unarmed Black men and women have had their lives taken at the hands of police and vigilante. These events and all that has transpired after them have brought me back to my own childhood and the decisions that my parents made about raising a Black boy in America that growing up I didn't always understand in the way that I do now. I think of how hard it must have been, how profoundly unfair it must have felt for them to feel like they had to strip away parts of my childhood just so that I could come home at night. For example, I think of how one night when I was around 12 years old on an overnight field trip to another city, my friends and I bought super soakers and turned the hotel parking lot into our own water-filled battle zone. We hid behind cars, running through the darkness that lay between the streetlights. Boundless laughter ubiquitous across the pavement. But within 10 minutes, my father came outside, grabbed me by my forearm, and led me into our room with an unfamiliar grip. Before I could say anything, tell him how foolish he had made me look in front of my friends, he derided me for being so naive. Looked me in the eye, fear consuming his face, and said, "Son, I'm sorry, but you can't act the same as your white friends. You can't pretend to shoot guns. You can't run around in the dark. You can't hide behind anything other than your own teeth." I know now how scared he must have been. How easily I could have fallen into the empty of the night. That some man would mistake this water for a good reason to wash all of this away. These are the sorts of messages I've been inundated with my entire life. Always keep your hands where they can see them. Don't move too quickly. Take off your hood when the sun goes down. My parents raised me and my siblings in an armor of advice, an ocean of alarm bells so someone wouldn't steal the breath from our lungs, so that they wouldn't make a memory of this skin, so that we could be kids, not casket or concrete. And it's not because they thought it would make us better than anyone else. It's simply because they wanted to keep us alive. All of my Black friends were raised with the same message. The talk given to us when we became old enough to be mistaken for a nail ready to be hammered to the ground, when people made our melanin synonymous with something to be feared. But what does it do to a child to grow up knowing that you cannot simply be a child, that the whims of adolescence are too dangerous for your breath, that you cannot simply be curious, that you are not afforded the luxury of making a mistake, that someone's implicit bias might be the reason you don't wake up in the morning. But this cannot be what defines us. Because we had parents who raised us to understand that our bodies weren't meant for the backside of a bullet, but for flying kites and jumping rope and laughing until our stomachs burst. We had teachers who taught us how to raise our hands in class and not just to signal surrender. And that the only thing we should give up is the idea that we aren't worthy of this world. So when we say that Black lives matter, it's not because others don't. It's simply because we must affirm that we are worthy of existing without fear, when so many things tell us we are not. I want to live in a world where my son will not be presumed guilty the moment he is born, where a toy in his hand isn't mistaken for anything other than a toy. And I refuse to accept that we can't build this world into something new, some place where a child's name doesn't have to be written on a t-shirt or a tombstone, where the value of someone's life isn't determined by anything other than the fact that they had lungs, a place where every single one of us can breathe. Thank you.
So briefly, what do we think?
It's painful for me to hear that kind of story, and I know I've heard it before, and it's just painful for me to realize that young Black men do not feel safe, or they have to be raised from childhood on to know exactly what to do in order to stay alive. That is a sick commentary on our country.
Black women as well. And I would just point out that that is not a recent video.
True.
That is a video from 2015.
I'm grateful for everybody who sat in. A rough count was between 75 and 100 people participated one way or another, mostly by listening, but that's great. And a reminder, if you want to be on the mailing list, just write a chat with your email list, your email on it.
Something that was said just really clicked in my mind in a way that kind of hit me in the stomach. And I'm sorry, I don't know the woman who said it, but you said that Black men are afraid. And I think as a white woman growing up in the 60s and 70s, I was taught to be afraid of Black men. And so it's, so I see this kind of false equivalency of, you know, I think in general, I grew up in Racine, so as a female, I grew up not trusting men in general because of the crime level there, but thinking about someone else's fear and thinking about it in a really kind of another way, just made this more real for me. And so I just really want to thank you for sharing that today.
Amy, this is Deb Kolstegen, and I don't have any comment about the last video. This whole, I want to just thank everybody from DAT for sponsoring this. It's been an amazing conversation. But how can we get the recording of it if I want to share it with my daughter?
Excellent, great question. So I will end recording in about a minute. And then we'll move into the parking lot. But I will speak with our communications director tomorrow to get it uploaded to our site. And I will make it available to Community Action and to the Diversity Action team who co-host this event with us if they would like to place it on their websites as well. So it should be available in the near future at YWCA Rock County, and then hopefully Community Action and Diversity Action teams' websites.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So that was my 5-second teacher wait. As we conclude this evening, I just want to thank everyone. Watching the body of John Lewis lie in state in the rotunda was heavy for me today and also celebratory. And so this conversation helped to serve as inspiration. So I'm grateful to everyone for participating in that. Vicki, Neil, anything that you would like to add before we officially close and end our recording?
My comment pertains to the first video. And just remember that, you know, over 50 years ago, Martin Luther King, who we hold up as the peaceful protester who talked about love. And we were talking about, you know, like we want the peaceful protest so we can respect them, et cetera, et cetera. Remember, he was public enemy #1 that had his phones tapped by the FBI, so.
I would just like to say that the book that I just finished reading is How to Be an Anti-Racist. And I borrowed it from the Janesville Library as an audio email book. So it gives a lot of good basis for being an anti-racist.
Thank you, Neil. So we do want to be respectful of your time. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope that you will join us again next month on the 4th Monday from 5:30 to 7. As soon as I'm done speaking, I will end the recording and that will officially end our Courageous Conversations. But I invite you, if you would like to hang around for the parking lot, it will not be formally moderated, but will be a chance for you to continue the conversation. Thank you all so much.